carrier attack, so I fired toward the enemy. And as I lifted up, I saw two of them falling. We were taught that Americans were afraid. I don't think so. In that 20-plane formation, as planes were shut down, the rest would fill in and go forth bravely. I was very impressed.
Basically, it was the torpedo planes that kept the fighters down. Torpedo 8 was the first to sight the Japanese fleet. My understanding is that Waldron tried to call the fighters down to give him some protection, but they didn't come down. So they went in, and one by one were all shot down.
The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers proved the loss of the low-flying American torpedo bombers not to be in vain. They attack, virtually unchallenged by the Japanese fighters. The Japanese carriers are now alone and vulnerable.
The dive bombers came in, and there were no fighters. They just had a clear shot. The carriers' decks were completely loaded with ammunition and bombs, and the dive bombers were able to make runs without any fighter interference at all. And that's how they won the battle.
Midway ends Japan's dream of empire. They will never recover from the loss of 4 carriers and 234 of their best pilots. Two months after Midway, the Pacific War shifts to the Solomon Islands, where Japan will lose its more experienced pilots, many of them at Guadalcanal, which became known to the Japanese as the Island of Death. Located south of Japan's major naval and air base at Rabaul, Guadalcanal threatens Allied supply lines. To stop the Japanese construction of an air base, American troops invade Guadalcanal. It is the first Allied amphibious action of the Pacific. The Guadalcanal campaign is the beginning move of a land, sea, and air campaign to recover the Solomons and force Japan from Rabaul. After the capture of Guadalcanal, American engineers quickly complete and then expand the airstrip. It will be known as Henderson Field.
When we got to Guadalcanal, I didn't believe that you could be standing in mud and have dirt blowing in your face. That was the darndest bit of island I've ever been on in my life.
For the next 6 months, U.S. troops defend Henderson Field from land, sea, and air attacks as the Japanese seek to regain control of the island. The long-range capabilities of their bombers and fighters allow Japanese strikes against Guadalcanal from as far away as Rabaul. Leading many of the Japanese bombing missions is the Mitsubishi G4M, codenamed Betty. It has great range, but like so many Japanese aircraft, it offers little armored protection for its 7-man crew. From August to November of 1942, nearly 100 Japanese Bettys are lost at Guadalcanal. Avenger pilot Doug LaPierre recalls a Betty nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie.
Washing Machine Charlie was the Japanese bomber that came down to the islands every night just to annoy people and drop 1 or 2 bombs and keep you awake. We had one night run against Rabaul where we all flew in over Hospital Ridge and dropped torpedoes. And the fun part of that one was Washing Machine Charlie was returning to Rabaul as we were flying out. All the searchlights, Japanese searchlights, went up on poor old Washing Machine Charlie, and I could just picture what he was screaming down at them, and they shot him out of the sky as we ducked out of there about 50 feet above the water and went home.
LaPierre's plane, the Grumman TBF Avenger, originally designed solely as a torpedo bomber, proves so adaptable that it soon becomes the only bomber an aircraft carrier needs. Grumman would build over 10,000. And by 1943, The Avenger would be the most common of carrier bombers.
When the TVF went aboard ship, it was the heaviest and largest carrier-based airplane that had ever been constructed. The government gave Grumman, who was the designer and the original manufacturer, a very simple requirement. They used what we lovingly refer to as the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid.
Rugged and reliable, the Avenger helped stop Japan from retaking Guadalcanal. As Allied air forces gained control of the air, Japan is no longer able to support its troops isolated on many islands throughout the Pacific. In January of 1943, Japan abandons Guadalcanal. The prolonged battle has decimated the ranks of her veteran pilots. Those pilots had received 700 hours of flight training. By contrast, the new Japanese recruits receive only 150 hours. They are brave, but very inexperienced.
We were able to rescue our pilots, put them back with all the experience they had, and the Japanese kept losing pilots and obviously had no real replacements for them. As the war went on, we got stronger and they got weaker.
Throughout the Pacific, Allied air power isolates Japanese garrisons. In New Guinea, control of the air enables American paratroopers to drop unchallenged behind enemy lines. Spearheading the drive to liberate New Guinea and the Philippines is the 5th Air Force. Using unorthodox bombing tactics, the 5th is relentless in its attacks on Japanese ships and bases. Their slowly descending parabombs allow low-flying aircraft to escape the shockwave of the released bomb's explosion. Another low-altitude bombing technique used by B-25s skips bombs into the side of an enemy ship. Other B-25s, modified with forward-firing guns, strafe enemy vessels. In the Bismarck Sea, they sink a troop convoy from Rabaul, ending Japanese aspirations in New Guinea. Despite the dominance of Allied air forces, the victories are not without pain and sacrifice. The burial at sea of a dead pilot in his battered plane is a sad reminder of the cost of war. For both sides, there will be many more pilots and planes committed to the deep before this war is over. Unlike the Japanese, some U.S. pilots can be rotated back home to train new recruits. Some of these veteran airmen become the subjects of war bond and recruiting films.
You see, it's a matter of teamwork. It's the plane and the engines and the guns. It's the pilot and all the rest of the squadron. It's the guys in the air and the crew on the ground. And you people back here who build the planes and push these changes through for us. The riveters, the welders, the assemblers, the foremen, and all the rest. I don't know how to say it exactly. It's just something you gotta feel. It's a team all pulling together. And when it's clicking right, well, you just can't beat it, that's all.
Rated by many as the best fighter of the war, the F-4U Corsair is superior to the Zero in almost every performance category. Though early models have some difficulty landing on aircraft carriers at first, they soon become the plane of choice for many carrier pilots.
I hate Corsairs because they shot down so many of my men. Just hearing the name makes me angry.
Entering combat in 1943, the Corsair is one of the most effective Allied fighter planes of the war. Losing less than 200 of their own aircraft, Corsair pilots shoot down more than 2,000 enemy planes. A deadly partner of the Corsair is the P-38 Lightning. It is used extensively in Europe as well as the Pacific. It becomes famous in the Solomons as the aircraft that takes part in the longest fighter intercept operation of the war, the mission to hunt down Admiral Yamamoto. On April 18, 1943, an enemy Mitsubishi Betty bomber carrying Admiral Yamamoto departs on an inspection tour of Japanese bases. From monitoring secret Japanese codes, the Allies know the exact schedule of Yamamoto's mission. The order is given to intercept his plane. Loaded with extra fuel tanks to accommodate the 435-mile mission, 16 P-38s, led by pilot John Mitchell, prepare for the aerial intercept. As part of the kill team, Rex Barber's orders were to go after Yamamoto's plane.
We knew we were after Yamamoto, and we had instructions from headquarters at all cost, get him. Well, we had to find him first, and then we had to get him. And we really thought we would fly up there and come back with nothing. We would find him. Because if you've done much flying, you know how difficult it would be to intercept an airplane on those conditions. That's what surprised everybody, was the bogey's 11 o'clock high call. There he was.
For Zero pilot Kinji Yanagiya, it was a deadly surprise.
It was a ceremonial escort. I never dreamed that we would be attacked by P-38s and have the Admiral shot down. They came in from behind us, low, below the jungle, and I was not able to protect him.
The P-38s strike quickly. Yamamoto's aircraft, one of the two Bettys to go down, crashes through the jungle canopy. For Yamamoto, the war is over. The Japanese Empire loses its leading figure, a warrior whose strategic vision will never be replaced. By the end of the war, more than 8,000 P-38s have been built. Designed as a high-altitude interceptor, it uses its high speed and its superior altitude to dive at opponents, its nose-mounted cannon and 50 caliber machine guns blazing. The Lightning is deadly. It shoots down more Japanese aircraft than any other U.S. plane. The mobility and power of American carrier task forces enable the U.S. Pacific Fleet to attack anywhere in the Pacific. John Condon remembers the awesome scale of carrier operations.
People were awestruck when they'd take off and go up and look, and as far as you could see, there were carriers and capital ships, battleships and cruisers, and just literally hundreds and hundreds of them.
By 1944, Allied forces are advancing on the Philippines and closing in on Japan. Japanese and American carriers would duel again in the Marianas. In the Marianas, the Japanese fleet, supported by land-based bombers, waits for the advancing American forces. Though both sides have the same number of aircraft, there is now a great difference in the quality of those pilots and planes.
We went home, came back in Hellcats. And it was a totally different war in Hellcats. By the time we got back, we had, well, for instance, we'd go on fighter sweeps. We'd have 250 fighters. We called us the Big Blue Blanket.
Though less maneuverable than a Zero, the Hellcat is superior in speed, armor, and high-altitude performance. Over the course of the war, the Hellcat will shoot down more than 6,000 Japanese aircraft, 75% of all Navy kills, at a cost of 270 U.S. planes.
The Hellcat was perfectly suited. It had armor, it had firepower, it had the maneuverability, it had the performance that we needed, and it could do everything except really outturn a Japanese airplane on a one-on-one basis. And of course, with the tactics we used, very seldom did we get on a one-on-one basis. You know, we lived in the thing we called a target-rich environment. It was never a problem of finding them, it was a problem of surviving. We survived mainly because we just fired and forgot about them. And you turned and somebody else was there and you fired at them and you turned back immediately. And you had to keep turning to make sure your tail was, there's nobody sitting on your tail. We tried to keep the fight in the same area so that all of us could cover each other, and you can imagine what that is, a big melee with 40 or 50 airplanes just going all directions.
The Hellcat dominates the sky. At what will become known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, 373 Japanese planes are lost to better aircraft and better pilots. From recently captured air bases in the Marianas, a new bombing campaign begins. The destination is Japan, and the aircraft, the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. With its 141-foot wingspan and 20,000-pound bomb load, the B-29 is the largest and most powerful bomber of the war. It is also the most innovative. Heated and pressurized cabins allow the 10-man crew to work at high altitudes without oxygen masks and bulky flight gear. Its computerized gun control system allows the B-29's 12 50 caliber machine guns to provide deadly protection against hostile aircraft. As the key weapon in a strategic bombing campaign of Japan, the B-29 rains death and destruction on Japanese cities and industries. Traditional bombing proves much less effective than firebombing, which burns to the ground huge portions of Japan's cities with their wooden structures. Just 450 miles from Japan, Iwo Jima's island defenses are softened for an amphibious assault. A key element in the B-29 bombing campaign, the capture of Iwo Jima, will create a life raft for crippled B-29s and an airbase for fighter support. For those who will hit the beach, Iwo Jima becomes a nightmare of death and destruction. It is an island of volcanic ash that looks like a hell on earth. Soldiers on the ground call for air-to-ground support. Since there is no aerial opposition, some Corsairs and Hellcats are modified solely for support missions of bombing and strafing. Iwo Jima is a deadly killing field. It is a battle waged on the ground to support the battles waged in the air. A battle won by Marines advancing inch by inch, fighting an enemy determined to resist to the last man. The cost is high, but Iwo Jima falls. Over the course of the war, more than 2,000 aircraft, unable to make it all the way back to the Marianas, find a temporary home at Iwo Jima. Based permanently there are North American P-51 Mustangs. They provide fighter cover for the Super Fortress. Near the end of the Pacific Campaign, Mustangs, similar to this one, spend much of the war escorting B-29s over Japan. Its agility and maneuverability make it the favorite of many pilots as they sweep the sky free of Japanese aircraft. Free of escort duties, the Mustang is an effective fighter bomber for tactical airstrikes against Japanese industries. By 1945, Japan has few aircraft that can challenge the American domination of the air. Increasingly vanquished, growing ever more desperate, Japan now looks to the gods for a weapon to save the sacred homeland. That weapon will be the kamikaze. Their ceremonial headbands are symbolic ties to the warrior tradition and to the samurai ethic of self-sacrifice